Welcome to Twin Talk Politics. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Twin Talk Politics. And today we are beyond honored to be joined by Professor Eric Patashnik, Julis Rabinowitz Professor of Public Policy and Professor of Political Science, and recently appointed Director of the Tauman Center for American Politics and Policy at Brown University. So huge congratulations there. And as the New York Times put it so well, he is and might we add, if not the, leading scholar to why policies succeed or fail, and has written countless influential works on counter-mobilization, healthcare, and backlash, all of which we're so excited to talk to him about today. It's an honor to have you on, Professor.
Thank you. It's really great to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation. Thanks so much for having me.
Great. The first question on our podcast has always been a tradition of ours, where for all of our guests, it's always been a 50-50 guessing question of dumb luck. So if it's not evident by our similar looks or the podcast name being Twin Talk Politics, we're twins, unfortunately. So we are wondering if you could take that 50-50 guess at who do you think is Jason and who do you think is Jerry, just based on our different colored backgrounds. No pressure.
I believe you are Jerry.
Wow, that's right. Not a lot of people get that right, so congratulations on your part. Great. Now that you do know how to tell us apart, let's dive straight in the interview. Now, obviously, Jerry and I are well familiar with all the incredible things you've done, but for the listeners at home who might not be as familiar, we were wondering if you could give us a quick introduction and how you got interested in political science in the first place.
Sure. So it's interesting because I'm actually celebrating in the next week my 60th birthday. So I'm sort of in an introspective mood and thinking about like, where did my life go? And I have so much to be, happy with, and I feel very fortunate. But looking back on my life, probably my original interest in politics was because my dad worked for the federal government. So my dad worked originally for the Social Security Administration. He originally worked in a district office in dealing with clients, Social Security clients in Brooklyn, New York. And then that's where I was born. And then he was transferred to Social Security's headquarters, which was in Baltimore, Maryland, where I was raised. And he spent the first part of his career working for Social Security. Later on, he worked for the agency that ran the Medicare program.
Wow.
And so from a very early age, government to me was not something sort of abstract. It was something that real people, my dad, the people who worked in his office, were involved with. And a lot of the other kids in my neighborhood, when I was growing up, they had a lot of their parents worked for the government. And so it was always something that had a sort of very direct human element in my life. Of course, I knew that my dad and the people I knew were not the sum total of government. I understood there were political institutions out there and processes and Congress and the Constitution, but it made it feel less sort of remote. And it made me feel that that was a world that I could grasp and understand. And that was probably the original stimulus for me to be interested in public policy.
Wow, that's a really interesting story. So thank you for that. We wanted to dive straight in because we have so much to talk to you about. And we wanted to turn towards one of your works that we have been really intrigued by and engaging with a lot, counter-mobilization, policy feedback, and backlash in a polarized age. Backlash, as you point out, has, I think, long shaped American politics, but in recent years, there has been quite a distinctive shift from being concentrated around civil rights, as you say, back in the 1960s, to becoming far more diffused across issues like immigration, trade, education, etc. And for us, we found that your breakdown of the three structural elements that allow backlash to grow into a much more stronger political force, so motives, means, and political opportunity, especially compelling. And I'm sure you'll talk a lot more about that. But you also note that not all counter-mobilization groups respond in the same way, interestingly enough, since their reactions depend on things such as their internal civic capacity, and external incentives, ranging from things like open pushback to tactical withdrawal. Obviously, it gets a lot more complicated in the real world. So our question is, when policymakers are choosing their strategy for handling backlash, whether it's by ignoring it, lowering their sights, leaning in, or trying to manage it, how should they decide which approach fits the moment, and what risks do they run if they get it wrong?
Yeah, so thank you for that amazing summary of my recent book, Counter Mobilization, which was published by University of Chicago Press in late 2023, which already seems like a lifetime ago in American politics. Um,
Yeah.
I originally got interested in the book because there's been so much research among political scientists about how public policies mobilize support. We think a lot about program like Social Security that builds a powerful constituency, senior citizens who defend the program, and how policies become durable or not. And that's another topic that I've written a lot about. But one thing that I think we've seen is that public policy doesn't always mobilize support. Sometimes it's source of opposition. And so I've been interested in that phenomenon and studying in the book. And as you said, we often think about backlash. The canonical case is the backlash to civil rights in the 1960s, or even before that, Reconstruction. Certainly, issues around race and racial justice have been one of the most important areas where the federal government's moves have often triggered intense opposition
Yeah.
among groups that believe that those policies are harmful to their interests or values. But as you suggested, what's really been remarkable in American politics over the last several decades is how widespread this phenomenon is. We have seen the federal government's role in issue after issue mobilize opposition, from trade policy to immigration, abortion, some transgender issues. You can think about the massive counter mobilization against President Obama's Affordable Care Act,
Yeah.
on and on and on. And so, why is this happening? What accounts for this secular trend of the federal government doing things that not only fail to please some people, but also make people angry enough oftentimes to join protest movements, to write letters, to vote against incumbent politicians? Because it is somewhat puzzling. You would think that politicians oftentimes would only like to do popular things to
Mhm.
win election. So why do we so often see the federal government moving in direction that actually have the opposite kind of dynamic? And I think that what I talk about in the book is part of it is looking at the details of specific policies and why certain policies are more likely than others to mobilize opposition. As you suggested, there are some micro level factors. But stepping back, I think the overall context of American politics has changed dramatically. We're a much more polarized society than we used to be. And it's easy, I think, for younger people like yourselves, maybe some of your listeners, to forget that this was not always the case. Back in the 1960s and 70s, of course, there were often divides and there were a lot of conflicts over policies, but they often weren't along partisan lines. So, we would have environmental policies that might be supported by fairly moderate or liberal Republicans. We might have civil rights policies that were opposed by fairly conservative Democrats. In other words, the political process did not have this one cleavage that made it so much easier to organize teams
Wow.
that were either for or against. And polarization really lowers the transaction costs of generating an opposition to a policy. If all the politicians on one party sort of are for a policy and all the other politicians more or less are against the policy, as was true, say, with the Affordable Care Act, as was true with the Big Beautiful Bill,
Yeah.
well, that is really going to make it easier to sustain a backlash movement. So that's another thing that's happened. The other is simply that government plays so much of a larger role in life than was the case, say, in the 1950s. We've
Yeah.
seen the federal government penetrate policy sector after policy sector. And as government has grown, one of the feedback effects of that expansion in government role has been the mobilization of interest groups. And it's mobilized supportive coalitions. That's certainly true as government, starts providing benefits or offering subsidies in some area. The beneficiaries of those policies will often go to Washington, organize, and say, "Hey, we like those policies. Let's keep them going," and they will press for the continuation. And so, federal government has been, as one scholar put it, like a magnet that has drawn groups to Washington to mobilize as its role has expanded. But that's not been the only effect. It's also created incentives for groups that don't like those policies, that feel that they're bearing costs, to also mobilize. And so those two big trends, the broad expansion and broadening as Brian Jones has written about in his great book, The Great Broadening. The broadening of the federal government role has been a stimulus, as well as the polarization of the two parties have helped fuel backlash. That doesn't mean we see backlash on every single issue. It does vary, but as a secular trend, the context of the policy process is really different now than it used to be in America.
For sure. Just building straight off that, we wanted to ask about, I guess, the broader political environment in which backlash unfolds, and specifically on your idea of polarization. In your book, you argue that polarization has created a brand new dynamic where parties often see political advantages in strategically cultivating backlash against the other side's reform, whether that is to rally up their own base or draw, I don't know, attention away from the fissures within their own party. In other
Yes.
words, backlash is no longer just a consequence of policy change, but has also become an incentive structure for politicians themselves. So our question is, how does this transformation alter the durability and the broader consequences of policymaking?
Yeah, and so that's a great question. There's a kind of belief like, well, government is permanent. You can never change anything. These government programs go on forever. And that's actually not true. Empirical studies of the durability of laws, people like William Howell, who's the dean of the policy school at Johns Hopkins, Forrest Maltzman and colleagues at GW, there's been systematic empirical data looking at policy durability. And what we see is that that cliche is wrong. Actually, not all laws last forever. One of the most important factors that shapes the long-term longevity of policy commitments is partisanship and whether there's changes in coalitions. And so as policies are increasingly generating divides along partisan lines, that's one factor that makes them more fragile. If you have a policy that from the get-go lacks bipartisan support, well, that's going to be a risk factor for its long-term durability, even leaving aside the substantive design of the policy itself. And so, when we look at, for example, some of the Biden administration, why some of its policies have been eroded during Trump 2 in areas, some of the environmental commitments and other areas. Well, part of the reasons they were vulnerable, even though the Biden administration was trying to design policies that would deliver benefits and build up constituencies, and so they were aware of these threats, but it's really challenging to do that if you don't have any Republican support from the get-go, and then you lose control of the White House. And so as our not only as our politics become more polarized, but that's a very important dynamic, but there is this second dynamic, which is the partisan competition and how evenly matched the two parties are. We've still been basically a 50-50 nation
Yeah.
where almost every election can flip partisan control. That was not true during the post-war era. The Democrats were sort of naturally in control of Congress. The Republicans didn't control the House of Representatives, for example, until 1994 for decades. Yeah, the presidency flipped some, but there was people used to write about the permanent Democratic majority, and political scientists, when I was first in graduate school, thought that was the big problem, that the Democrats could never lose the House and that there was not enough competition, and that was really bad for democracy. Well, that's a different world now. And so
Yeah.
when you have these two parties that are flipping constantly, that's going to be a risk factor for policy durability as well.
Yeah, for sure. We'll definitely talk more about what makes policy durable and what does not later on in our conversation. But we actually just wanted to continue that and kind of zoom out and talk more about the divide between the progressives and conservatives on the topics of backlash. I think you emphasize that policy backlash is not inherently conservative, much like the existing scholarship. And even though historically conservatives have been more likely to harness it, often in response to government expansion. But interestingly enough, and I think you point this out, in recent years, with the right holding more power, we've seen progressive counter-mobilization surge around climate, immigration, Trump-era policies. So our question is, should we think of this as a cyclical cycle tied to who holds power, or does it suggest that backlash itself has become a permanent feature of governance, shaping how policies are made and contested across the board?
Yeah. So as you said, what we have seen empirically over time most policy backlash historically has been, to the extent that the backlash has a ideological direction, and not all backlash does. But if we, one of the things I do in my book is I have a data base where I code New York Times articles
Sure.
about backlash episodes between the 1960s and up through the 2010s. And my research assistants and I at Brown read all these articles and coded them in lots of ways. And what we found in the first impression, which I think is consistent with what many people believe, is that most backlash in the US over that period, to the extent it has an ideological valence, has been from the right. Well, why is that? It's because policy is moving away from the status quo and most policy changes over that period has been toward the left. Even under Republican administrations, it's usually been difficult historically to eliminate programs, to eliminate agencies. Even under Republican presidents like Reagan and Bush, a lot of those actual policy changes, not always ones they were so enthusiastic about, were expanding the federal government's role in some area, more regulation, more spending, and so on, an expansion of a social benefit or an environmental program. For example, under George H.W. Bush, Republican president, we had two landmark laws, the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. Those were landmark health and environmental laws, some of the most important of the last half century, and they happened under a Republican president. And so that was the pattern. But as Republicans have not only begun to win elections, which they
Yeah.
had been doing, but as they've actually begun moving the policy status quo in a more conservative direction, which
Mhm.
has been on steroids, and Trump too, in ways that I had never anticipated seeing, well, more and more you're beginning to see that the losers from these policies are more progressive groups in
Yeah.
areas of environment, immigration. We saw a tremendous amount of progressive backlash, for example, during the first Trump administration against his family separation policy. We
Right.
saw it initially against some of the anti-transgender rights policies. We've seen it against efforts to pull back affirmative action,
Mhm.
voting rights, other areas like, oh, it's certainly one of the most intense cases was the unsuccessful effort to repeal the Affordable Care Act during the first Trump administration in 2017. We saw a lot of counter mobilization from liberal groups at that time. And so um, really the ideological direction of backlash is contingent on the ideological direction of policy change. And as finally, after many, many decades where Republicans and conservatives were able to amass political power, but the existing liberal policy order was fairly entrenched, much to their frustration, now we are actually seeing substantial change in the de facto elimination of some programs, sometimes through executive
Yeah.
orders, often not through laws, through Supreme Court decisions allowing at least temporarily these changes to occur, the firing of civil servants, a really elimination of programs de facto like USAID, a big retrenchment of affirmative action for Black Americans and for other traditional marginalized groups. Significant deportations in policy area after policy area. The status quo is moving and moving far and moving fast. And now we are seeing, I think, some backlash of certainly of progressive groups. We're also seeing some changes in public opinion. For example, public opinion on abortion has become more progressive
Yeah.
since the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And so, for sure, this is a big phenomenon. I think it's also interesting, though, to point out that in some ways, some of the backlash that we're seeing, which does exist, and even there's been some data that there's a lot more protests than I think people realize is happening,
Yeah,
and
definitely.
we're not quite feeling it because they've been more they haven't been as concentrated in one place in time. They've been more diffuse across the country, but
Yeah.
they are happening. Nonetheless, I think a case can be made that maybe the backlash that we're seeing doesn't seem on the surface to be quite equal to the scale and scope of the ferocity of the changes from the second Trump administration. I think my book actually does help explain that puzzle. And that is quite a lot of the most consequential policy changes that the Trump administration are making are really imposing costs that are long-term rather than present, such as a long-term degradation of our science, public health, um, future economic growth possibilities for the US, or the costs are diffuse, not necessarily concentrated on a specific group. Even in the big, beautiful bill, which is going to impose significant costs in healthcare, cuts in Medicaid, a lot of those were strategically designed to occur after the midterm elections. There was
Yeah.
an effort to manage backlash there. So
Wow.
we are seeing, for sure, public opinion moving against the administration in some of these areas. We are seeing some mobilization of groups, but we also, I think, consistent with my book, is that to the extent that a lot of these most far-reaching changes in federal government capacity, administrative capacity, are imposing future costs, such as the future capacity of the federal government to create scientific breakthroughs 20 years from now, or are imposing costs that are distant or on poorly mobilized constituencies. Like, for example, the I think the canonical example here would be USAID, right? Imposing costs on foreign nations, on poor children in other countries that are not immediately visible to ordinary Americans. It's not so surprising that the backlash forces have not been as strongly triggered in those areas, even though those policies are not only changing the status quo a lot, but also imposing a lot of costs. Um, and so if we look systematically at where the Trump administration is changing policy, and we look at the political response to them, I think we can make sense of them by looking at the distribution and timing of those costs.
For sure. And then the last question we'll ask in this book is the nuanced argument you suggest that backlash is not always purely destructive. It can also function sometimes as a form of policy feedback, and I guess even in some cases contribute positively to democratic pluralism in the case of teaching policymakers what solutions are broadly accepted, such, I think as you point out, such as the lead up to the Inflation Reduction Act. So our question here is, what, in your view, distinguishes a form of backlash that is democratically healthy from one that is much more corrosive to policy legitimacy and trust in the government?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And, if the political system were working perfectly efficiently, if it were like this well-oiled machine that was a learning machine, well, it would receive information constantly. Again, I mentioned Brian Jones, but he's done excellent work on this. We wouldn't see these big lurches, right? You would have government and they would realize, like, oh, our policy role in some sector is not quite working exactly right. There's some problems with it. Let's tweak it. Let's adjust it. But that doesn't always happen. There are long lags. Our institutions make policy change difficult. And so sometimes what happens is we have a policy that is maybe imposing some costs on a constituency, and it takes a long time for the political system to realize that it could do better. And when the government gets out of sync with that learning, one of the ways that it can lurch back into something like an equilibrium is some group mobilizes and says, "Hey, we really, really think this is a problem for us." We're beginning to see that now with, say, the YIMBY movement, right? Which is in some ways a backlash against restrictive zoning laws that are imposing a big cost on people that are trying to buy homes because they're making it very, very expensive. It would have been better if we didn't have that reaction. But now that we have this movement that is beginning to mobilize and saying these existing policies are making it too expensive for young people to buy a house, at least the political system is getting that signal. And so there could be some learning there. Now, how would I distinguish a sort of legitimate backlash from a bad backlash? Well, backlashes that are about trying to send a signal to the government, this policy is imposing costs on us or is not really achieving its own goals, that seems like something that is consistent with democracy. A backlash where you have people who are saying, we don't want the government to give rights to this other group that we don't like. We dislike this other group. You think about the white backlash to the civil rights
Mm,
laws.
no
Well,
doubt.
what was the problem there? There were some white Americans whose they were angry, they were resentful of the fact that other Americans were receiving equal rights. They wanted to maintain their place in a social hierarchy.
Right.
And in that case, their backlash was less about saying, we feel that our equal rights as citizens are not being respected. And it was more about us not liking another constituency having their equal rights respected.
Wow.
And that, I think, was an anti-democratic backlash. It
For
was
sure.
less about trying to get the government to treat our constituency fairly, and it was more about resentment that another group was finally receiving their just due. So I would distinguish those two kinds of cases.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for all your insightful responses. I think that wraps up the part of our conversation specifically about backlash. Uh, Now we kind of want to transition first towards your book, Unhealthy Politics. I think without a doubt, one of the most interesting books we've ever read in political science is your work, Unhealthy Politics, the battle over evidence-based medicine. And we were particularly struck by your finding that less than half of healthcare delivered in the United States, at least in time of writing the book, is based on adequate evidence of its effectiveness. And even when new evidence is accepted by overcoming the resistance from these medical societies, implementation often takes 10 to 15 years. And we know in the book, you explore this issue in depth, specifically analyzing the public, physicians, and politicians. And what stood out to us the most was the political dimension of things. Because as you found, because of the unique and enormous trust people place onto their doctors, politicians often lack the incentive to challenge the doctors and physicians' authorities, since even when they support the most rigorous evidence to overturn existing practices, it's a politician's reputation that suffers. So our question is, what structural or institutional changes do you believe could incentivize politicians to actively engage, I know, in what you call political entrepreneurship, particularly in challenging unjustly entrenched medical interests?
Well, thank you for that remarkably lucid and compact summary of this really long book that I worked on with my colleagues Alan Gerber and Connor Dowling for many years. So, just to recap, yeah, this is a book about this puzzle that in the United States, in other countries too, but I think we have some particular features that make it more pronounced in the US. Even though the US spends more than any other country on healthcare, and even though we've had some of the leading medical researchers in the world, despite though that our heavy investment and despite having all this talent in the US, it's not the case that even a well-insured American who goes to see a leading doctor can be assured that the treatment that they get is necessarily the best available treatment for their condition. So what does that mean? There could be, say, a common ailment, back pain, and maybe there's several different ways that doctors could treat that condition. You could have pain-killing drugs. You could do physical therapy. There could be a surgery. If the healthcare system were working really efficiently, well, everyone would kind of figure this out pretty quickly. Doctors would, researchers would do rigorous studies of which treatment is best, A, B, or C. And if there was any uncertainty about this because it was hard to figure out, well, they would do more studies. And then over time, there would be a pretty good consensus that, like, yeah, B is really better
Yeah.
than A and C, or A and C are about equal, but B is not as good. And then if the healthcare system were again perfect, well, that information would quickly diffuse out to doctors all over the country. It wouldn't make a difference if you're living in Providence or in Philadelphia or San Francisco. You go see a doctor, they would read the medical journals, and you would get the best treatment for your condition. Unfortunately, that's not how it always works. A lot of treatments diffuse into common practice in American healthcare on the basis of weak evidence. That's especially true for surgical procedures and others. Even when we have things that go through a rigorous review process, like new pharmaceutical products, drugs, often the only question that regulators are asking is, does this drug work better than a placebo? Not always the comparative question, does drug A work better than drug B versus better than drug C? That's really what you want to know when you're a patient. And even when that information does exist, and we often lack those studies, really that we often lack the research that we need to answer the questions that patients most want to know the answers to, that information doesn't immediately change practice.
Yeah.
It's sluggish. The argument of the book is not that the American healthcare system has no responsiveness to evidence. Of course, that would be an overstatement, but it's slow. It takes a while for that information to diffuse into practice. Doctors train a certain way in medical school. The doctors in a particular part of the country might all practice in a certain way, and they have a sort of their own practice style, or the practice style of their hospital or their local community, and it can take a while for things to change. And so this phenomenon, as you said, the Institute of Medicine, I think, had a study in the 2007 or so at that time, estimating that no more than half of all
Yeah.
treatments that Americans receive is really based on very strong evidence about what works best for their particular condition. This has been widely recognized. There's been, many, many studies about this problem. Um, and the challenge is to correct it. And there have been some effort to do some things about it. Under the Obama administration and during the Affordable Care Act, we created a new research agency, PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, to do some research. So it's not been the case that there's been no recognition of the problem. But nonetheless, agencies like that still don't really have very much, relatively speaking, compared to how much we spend on healthcare. Their budgets are relatively small
Yeah.
compared to the scope of the problem. And what we've been unwilling to do is tie that research to coverage decisions by Medicare, for example. So or payment decisions by Medicare. We've been reluctant to do that in an aggressive way in the US for fear of rationing healthcare. That looks like the government is getting in the way of the personal relationship between doctors and individual
Yeah.
patients. And Americans have very little trust in government when it comes to healthcare.
Yeah.
The only actor that they do trust, they don't really trust the federal government. They
Yeah.
don't trust health insurers. They don't trust pharmaceutical firms. In fact, we've done a lot of public opinion work in this area. We found that a lot of Americans are so distrustful of pharmaceutical firms. They think drug companies are keeping cures for diseases like cancer secret from the public in order to protect their profits. So there's a lot of conspiracy thinking among the public about this. So the only group that they really trust the most when it comes to healthcare are doctors. And the problem that we depict in the book is that there's been some movement among doctors, for sure, especially some younger doctors, to try to promote more evidence-based care. And that's great. And most doctors do, of course, believe in promoting evidence-based medicine in the abstract. The challenge happens when a study in a particular doctor's specialty area comes out that says this treatment that this group of doctors performs works less well than they believed. There can often be a kind of defensiveness about making changes in practice patterns. And there can be some good reasons for that. Doctors sort of have a lot of experience in this area. They might not really believe one study. Any one study might indeed have some flaws. Sometimes there can be a kind of cognitive dissonance. The
Yeah.
doctors don't really sort of believe, like, well, I've seen my patients with my own eyes, and this study, I can't really jive with what I'm seeing. So there are lots of reasons why doctors might be slower to change their practice. There can be financial incentives, which is sometimes doctors are paid not by curing patients, but by the number of procedures they perform under a fee-for-service system. And doctors want to maintain their clinical autonomy. They don't really want to have some third party, let alone government or other actors, second guessing their clinical decisions. So, for all of those reasons, there sometimes can be a kind of defensiveness among doctors when research calls into question common treatments in the area. We show in the book that if doctors were to really lead in this area, if they were to say, let's really change the healthcare system to make sure that evidence guides more effectively the delivery of care, the public would go along with this, pretty much Republicans and Democrats, because of the great trust that they have across the board
Yeah.
in physicians. It's declined a bit in recent years, but nonetheless, doctors are really the only group that can still, except for nurses, they're the other group as well. A high degree of trust among Americans across the political spectrum, but we haven't always seen that kind of leadership from the medical profession, and it's really difficult for a politician. Let's say you're a politician and you're concerned that about this. You really think that we could be doing better by patients, and I do think patient welfare is the most important thing here. That should be at the paramount, but you might also be concerned about wasteful spending under the Medicare program, the federal budget deficit. If you were, a politician that understood this issue and you said, like, I really want to, use public policy to try to improve things, what we show in the book is this is going to be tough. This is going to be an uphill battle because if you wade into these waters and you do anything that doctors don't like, and you get into any kind of controversy with doctors, well, what's the average voter going to think when they read about this controversy in the newspaper or they see it on social media? Anytime that there's a conflict between doctors and politicians, we show the average voter is going to say, who am I going to believe? I'm going to believe the doctor.
Doctor, yeah.
What does this politician know about healthcare? And it's even worse than that. It's not only we show in some experimental surveys that the politician, even if they are, excuse me, objectively right about the medical science, and the doctors group is actually, just acting in a defensive way, not only can the politician not persuade the voter in that area? Actually, it's even worse for the politician than that. Their own reputation with the voter is going to go down. The voter is more likely to think that that politician is not really a very good politician because what kind of politician would, you know, challenge doctors? They know better about healthcare. And so it's a completely lose-lose proposition
Yeah.
for the politician. And what that suggests is that in a policy area like healthcare, where basically we delegate all this authority to a well-respected professional group like doctors, if doctors don't use their public authority to lead and to be at the pushing for reform and making healthcare better, it's really difficult for the political process to do anything about it. And we could get stuck, in other words, in an equilibrium where we're continuing to spend a lot of money and we're not always delivering the best evidence-based care to patients.
Yeah, wow. Thank you for that very nuanced answer. Again, one of the most interesting books we've ever and probably will ever read in political science. So if you haven't picked one up, please do. We kind of want to transition away and talk about your other book, this one. So one aspect of public policy we know you focus on is dynamic nature, both pre and post implementation phases. And what really stood out to us was how early efforts to really ease the integration of a new reform can sometimes produce unintended consequences. Specifically, when drafting and passing policies, policymakers have to compensate, I know, as you refer to in the book, as losers, or otherwise known as like the constituency negatively or adversely affected, in attempts to retain their political support. And I think, as you point out, I think there's a strategy often becomes a trap with the losers growing accustomed to compensation, demanding even more, or threatening and strong arming to leave to go to the opposition if their expectations are not met. So, how do you see this tension affecting the long-term sustainability of major reforms, and what strategies might help policymakers avoid the cycle?
Yeah, you're right. And so compensating losers can often be a way to ease the passage of bills that impose concentrated costs on some well-organized group.
Mhm.
Many bills are not pristine. And from a pragmatic perspective, it can often make sense to do that if the overall social benefits are so great. It might be worth it to, hand out some particularistic benefits to some of the losers from the bill. And certainly, I would argue that that is something that a responsible policymaker can do. The problem is if you're trying to reform a particular policy sector where there's a dominant organized clientele group, it's not so much that the compensation itself is the problem. It's that the goal is to actually create a new equilibrium where the government is not constantly giving out those particularistic favors.
Yeah.
And there we've often seen problems. So, for example, the landmark Tax Reform Act of 1986, which seems like a lifetime ago, the way our tax policy now is, which has become an even greater mess. But that was really one of the most highly praised public policies, economic policies of the 20th century. The federal tax code in the 1960s and 70s, it ended up expanding a lot of special tax breaks for industry groups and others. But under President Ronald Reagan, there was an effort to simultaneously lower tax rates and eliminate some of these special tax breaks. And in order to make the tax code more economically efficient, more equitable across the board horizontally. And it was really one that at the time, many observers said, this bill will never pass. This is impossible. Washington cannot do this. It has so many powerful interest groups. There is no way that Congress is going to have the political courage to get this done. And yet Congress did do it. It was amazing. And it was an accomplishment. Now, not all of that bill has been lost. There were still vestiges left of that tax bill. Rates do remain lower than they used to be. Some of the corporate tax breaks that were the most egregious have not reappeared. Nonetheless, there was a hope at the time that that bill was passed that the fundamental dynamics of U.S. tax policymaking would permanently shift, that Congress would get out of the business of giving out special tax breaks to favored groups. At the time, there was a cartoon that ran in the newspapers that showed the Ways and Means Committee that writes the tax bills, and that had on the door of the Ways and Means Committee, "Gone fishing." Like, we're out of business. We are not doing this anymore. And the implication was like, donors and lobbies should not give campaign contributions to these actors because they're not going to be doing this. They're not playing this game anymore of collecting campaign donations and using every tax bill to sort of create some new tax break for some particular group or not. And that really didn't happen. Even though some of the old tax breaks stayed away, we ended up creating new ones.
Yeah.
And a lot of new ones for social interest. There are so many social tax breaks, no one can keep track of them anymore. Um, and even under the a big beautiful bill, we have some new ones as well. And the tax code is still extremely complicated and it's still quite messy and inefficient. And why was that? The reason was we didn't really change the fundamental institutions. We didn't change the rules of the game to make it harder for Congress to do that. We didn't delegate tax writing authority to some independent board or create something like the Fed for tax policy. I'm not saying necessarily we should do that. I don't think there may be, the efficiency gains may not be worth the small d democratic losses, but it's not so surprising that the accomplishments of the Tax Reform Act of 1986, if they've not been repealed outright, they've nonetheless been eroded. We've layered on top of that act many, many different layers of subsequent tax bills, and a lot of them have been very inefficient and particularistic. Same kind of thing in the agricultural area. We tried to eliminate rather subsidies for farmers, and that effort, although it succeeded in eliminating some of the most inefficient regulations that dictated to farmers like how and when they could plant and what crops that were very inefficient. The idea that the federal government was going to get out of the business of giving money to agriculture, and many of those interests are actually quite affluent, that really didn't succeed. We didn't durably reconfigure the dynamics. Where we have reconfigured the dynamics has been where we've changed institutions and totally changed the coalitional dynamics in that sector. So, for example, in the airline sector, the federal government, amazingly, it's hard for probably people today to believe, used to heavily micromanage and regulate
Oh,
the airline industry. What flight routes a particular airline could charge, could fly, and even how much they could charge. So the airlines used to not be able to compete on price, for example. They
Wow.
had to compete with other things like, how nice the service was. And as a result of that, prices tend to be back in the 60s and early 70s pretty high. Now, this wasn't bad if you were an affluent business flyer and if like your ticket was being paid for by your company. Flying was a pretty nifty experience.
Yeah.
You go on the plane, it might be expensive, but the quality in coach would have been really pretty darn nice
Yeah.
and business class like off the charts. But flying was expensive. And it was something that many ordinary Americans couldn't afford to do. And they couldn't really afford to go visit grandma a couple times a year across country. And the reason was we didn't allow the market to compete and create competition over prices. Well, we deregulated the airlines under President Jimmy Carter in 1978. Again, this was a bipartisan thing. And so the Democrats back then used to recognize that government could overregulate in some areas. We're actually seeing, in some ways, the return of that concern with the rise of the abundance movement now. Actually, think that maybe sometimes government regulation needs to be pared back a little bit. But we did pass that reform. Most economists would argue that it was successful, that it did lower prices. It's true that now that the airlines are competing on prices, flying is, not as pleasant an experience. It's more like a bus. It's less fancy. And some upper middle class people might complain about it, but it's made flying much more accessible for ordinary working class Americans than it used to be. Why has that reform endured? It's endured because we changed the institutions. We used to have a federal agency, the CAB, that regulated airlines. Well, we eliminated that agency. Um, there's no one agency that focuses just on airline regulation. Now, any regulation of airlines are part of the Department of Transportation, which has a much broader remit, and it's going to subject that to much broader set of considerations. And the whole constellation of interest group actors in the airline sector was totally transformed and reshuffled as a result of airline deregulation and the new price competition. Some of the pre-existing carriers that were in business before airline deregulation, like TWA and others, they went out of business. They could not make it in this new cutthroat world of competition. And so there was kind of a survival of the fittest, and only the companies that were able to profit in a deregulated world survived. We saw a lot of mergers and acquisitions. So we don't have the same groups that are there that would be lobbying for a restoration of their economic rents. Some of them actually, were weeded out of the sector. And so it's selected rather than interest groups creating the policy that they want, the policy created the interest groups that could survive in
Wow.
that. And so it really transformed policymaking, the ultimate policy feedback. And we have not always seen that. And that is really what I call in the book Reforms at Risk, the reconfiguration of a policy sector that creates the most durable reforms.
For sure. And we're just exactly going to talk about that now. So I guess that's a perfect transition. So your work outlines four possible scenarios of policy outcomes, ranging from those likely to be overturned to those that endure, and explores the factors that make them so. As you said just now, the most powerful outcome, and the best one probably, is reconfiguration, which you attribute to the emergence of new interest groups, fresh coalitions, shifts in lobbying pattern, and I guess most importantly, the active investment of the new actors in the policy, factors that make it deeply, I guess, entrenched and difficult to overturn. Our question is, what distinguishes reforms that generate entirely new stakeholders from those that merely rearrange existing ones, assuming both are heavily interested in reform? And how does this distinction shape their long-term sustainability?
Yeah, so it's really about the reconfiguration is about creating new interests and eliminating old ones. And some of the reforms that I looked at harness market forces. Markets are incredibly disruptive in a positive way for accomplishing that goal. And so that is one strategy that can be used is unleashing market forces in a sector, injecting market forces in a sector that didn't previously have them, can sometimes really reshuffle coalitional alignments. The other one that can be hard is, eliminating existing interests is the biggest challenge when you're trying to reform a sector. And that is something that is really hard to do, especially if you don't tarnish the interests.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can do it in a way where you withdraw benefits from a particular group, but as long as that group is not stigmatized and it retains some public standing, the ability to lobby in Washington, it may be able to regroup to recoup its losses. So that can be a challenge because from the standpoint of these well-organized groups, they have really long time horizons. The public doesn't. The general public is looking at the moment. And some of these reforms, the public gets really activated and they mobilize, and they're a force for making the reform happen, but their public interest is fleeting. But the vested interest, as Terry Moe has written about, they stick around. They have resources, they have institutional knowledge, and they know, they can lose a given battle sometimes, but they might not lose the war. And
Wow.
so they understand that they are in it for the long term. And that is another part of the reason why reforms are so hard to sustain, especially these general interest reforms that we've been talking about that provide diffuse benefits to the public and impose concentrated costs on narrow groups. They're particularly hard to reform because part of the dynamic that leads to the passage of those reforms in the first instance is public mobilization, and public mobilization is fleeting. The public is not going to sustain itself. Now, what I think doesn't happen enough is sometimes you have these advocacy groups that are very important and they do help pass the reforms, but they could be helping to sustain the reforms by staying involved in the post-enactment dynamics for the long term.
Yeah.
And they often don't do that. You see advocacy groups that will mobilize for reform in some area. They'll do a campaign, they'll get on the media, they'll do social media. And then if they win, they get super excited and they say, yay, we won something. But what they don't often realize enough is actually they haven't won anything. All they
Mhm.
really want is the initial passage of the bill. And what's really going to determine is whether that bill becomes entrenched, which
Yeah.
research
Wow.
suggests can often take a decade or more. Will Howe and others have looked at how long it can take for policies to develop these routes. And donor groups, for example, that support these advocacy campaigns, they need to understand if you really care about this policy, you need to give enough money to sustain the advocacy campaign for a decade, because the vested interest in others that lose under some of these policies, they know that the game hasn't ended and they're not going anywhere. And so don't move on to the next sexy thing. You got to keep fighting that battle until it's really won. And I think that is one of the lessons of the book is that politicians who are entrepreneurs, who want to pass these policies, advocacy groups, philanthropic groups, the media coverage, all of this needs to develop much longer time horizons. Because at the end of the day, the fate of these laws depends not on what happens at the moment of enactment, but what happens 1, 5, 10 years later. That's really going to determine the outcome of these policies.
Yeah, cool. Thank you so much. And just talking a little bit more about time horizons, that's kind of what we wanted to focus a little bit on in our final quick question before our fun question to end it all. But we just wanted to ask about the changing forces shaping policy today. I think in your earlier works, you emphasize there's a large plethora of different factors, but institutional feedback is one of the big and largely determines whether a policy endures. But of course, when you did those works or when you wrote those studies, social media was not yet fully developed or used very differently than it is today. So with the rise of online activism and rapid digital organization, we're very curious to hear your thoughts on how you think that these dynamics are influencing the trajectory of current policy change, both in making reforms more resilient and in fueling efforts to unravel them.
Yeah, I mean, social media um, I think is remarkably powerful tool of mobilization. It lowers the cost of recognizing groups that are similarly situated. That could be hard to do in the past. If you have some policy that imposes costs on people living in different parts of the country, they might not all recognize they have a shared fate. That lowers the barriers. And it also, the marginal cost of saying something outrageous is like zero, right?
Yeah.
And so it used to be hard to get attention for being angry about something.
Yeah.
Social media has really lowered the costs of that. And we've seen a lot of that in sort of backlash to bathroom bills and either ways on transgender rights in both directions, liberal and conservative. So, I think social media has been an accelerant of anger. I think it's been an accelerant of the ability of people to claim themselves the status of victims, and it is a way of generating media attention and coverage, sometimes far out of proportion to the actual stakes. There can be a lot of outrage mobilized for things that really don't objectively warrant it. And social media has been a powerful tool in that way. Um, I don't think it means that every policy will automatically generate a strong reaction.
Mhm.
It's still the case that policies that impose costs on vulnerable, distant groups are going to be less likely to mobilize outrage than policies that impose costs on sympathetic groups today. It's no surprise that, we're not seeing marching in the streets against the elimination of USAID and things like that. Even though people are upset about it, it's still not going to affect the average American voter the same way. But social media is part of our context now, and it's interesting to think about if some of the cases, that I write about in my Backlash book, if social media had been available then, how would the dynamics have changed? If we had had, for example, social media or Fox News after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, or after the passage of Medicare and some other landmark programs, would the dynamics have been different? It's interesting to think about that.
Yeah, for sure. Um, Thank you for all your very insightful answers to all of our questions. But I think it's time to ask our final and fun question to end it all off. We know you're a pretty big tennis fan, especially as the US Open just concluded. We just had to ask our question. So, with the rise of the Sinner and Alcaraz era, who do you think will come on top as a better player?
Well, that is a great question. I suppose you saw I probably tweeted something out. I went to the U.S.
Yeah,
Open
yeah,
and for a day, and so I tweeted out a couple of pictures I took, which was a great experience. And yes, I am a big tennis fan. I think that this rivalry is great for the sport. There'd been a lot of concern after the end of the big three. Of course,
yeah,
Djokovic is still here, and he is probably objectively still the third best player in the world at 38, I think, which is a remarkable accomplishment.
yeah,
Uh, it does seem hard for me to believe he's going to win another major unless
yeah,
something crazy happens. Uh, because, can you beat Alcaraz and Sinner in the same tournament at his age would just be seemingly an impossible accomplishment. Um, I was very excited to see that Sinner is taking the loss in a very mature way.
mhm,
Both of these guys are super impressive. They both have great respect for each other and for the game. They both want to improve. We read that Alcaraz, after his Wimbledon loss, spent 15 days or so working with his coach, just trying to develop a specific plan to beat Sinner. And now it's going to
yeah,
be Sinner's turn to
yeah,
figure out a way to do it. If I had to guess, I mean, I think in the long run that Alcaraz will come out on top, just because I think he has a little bit greater versatility potential. I think he has greater ability to play different kinds of games from the baseline. His passing shots are amazing. I think his serve has improved significantly. Um, and his placement is getting better. His net play is not A plus yet, but it is significantly better. And I think his inherent athleticism,
Mm.
creativity, and versatility means he has more ways he can win. Um, Sinner is when Sinner is on the right surface, there is he really combines a lot of the best of Djokovic, and I think of players like the ball striking of an Agassi as well. There's a cleanness to his hitting that is really impressive. Um, but if I had to say who's going to have more majors in 10 years,
Yeah.
I would pick Alcaraz.
Wow, thank you so much for your take. You really sound like a true sports analyst there. So thank you
Yeah.
for that. All right, I think that concludes our interview today. Again, Jared and I would like to extend a huge, huge thank you to Professor Patashnik from the bottom of our hearts for this wonderful opportunity and taking the time out of his incredibly busy schedule to actually come here and speak with us. It truly means the world to us. We really, really appreciate it. For all the listeners at home, if you guys wish to see more interviews like this, be sure to tune into future episodes. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you guys next time.